Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for listening to the Tuesday edition of Point of View. And over the next hour, we're going to cover a number of things having to do with the virus pandemic. And it's probably not good news, because we had Dr. Anthony Fauci today testifying before the United States Senate in a kind of an awkward way, because after all, he's trying to quarantine at the moment because he's been exposed to the COVID-19, but possibly won't actually come down with it. But nevertheless, he's in one facility. The senators are in another. It is not your typical venue where an individual sitting in the Senate room and they're having a chance to talk to him across the table. But nevertheless, he began to talk about a number of issues that I want to unfold. It's not good news for those of you that were hoping to send kids back to school in the fall. It's not good news for those of you that were hoping that we'd have a baseball season at the end of the summer and a variety of other things. But nevertheless, let's talk about that. But before we do so, just again to illustrate the incredible division in our country right now, instead of having the Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer be so grateful that there is an opportunity to talk to this individual, he made the snarky comment, well, it'll be fun to finally have a chance to hear Dr. Anthony Fauci without Donald Trump, in a sense, looking over his shoulder. If that's a quote, it's at least pretty close to it. And I thought it was kind of interesting. The press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, said, well, maybe Senator Schumer was sleeping over the Sundays, because we sent Anthony Fauci out to numerous Sunday talk shows, and you could have had a chance to hear from him then without Donald Trump looking over his shoulder. So right off the bat, there was an attempt to say, well, there's been this conspiracy of silence, so now we'll actually get the actual facts. But nevertheless, let's pick out a few of these, and that is on this Tuesday testimony by Dr. Anthony Fauci. He made it pretty clear that if you think the schools are going to start in the fall, probably not. Now, the natural reaction is to say, well, who is he to tell? Well, let's just think this through for just a minute. We already have a lot of doctors wondering whether or not it would be safe to send kids back to school in the fall. We have lawsuits surfacing almost instantaneously in any institution which might be, if you will, rushing the situation. And, of course, you have, as one of my commentaries, which will be coming out next week, points out, that the most significant survey done so far of Americans found that 40% of Americans said they would probably avoid public spaces unless absolutely necessary long after the coronavirus pandemic has subsided. Nobody believes that it will have subsided in the fall. And if you think that adults are not going to go out to public spaces, do you think they're going to put their kids in public spaces? I think you know the answer to that one. But let's go back to Dr. Anthony Fauci, because he was asked by Lamar Alexander, who is a Republican, also, of course, was very influential, of course, in the Department of Education in the past. But anyway, a Republican senator from Tennessee. He chairs now, of course, the Senate Committee on Health, Education, and Labor, and was asking Anthony Fauci to look down the road over the next 3 months. The specific quote was this: Doctor, let's look down the road 3 months. There will be 5,000 campuses across the country trying to welcome 20 million college students, 100,000 public schools welcoming 50 million students. So what would you say to the chancellor of the University of Tennessee in Knoxville or the principal of a public school about how to persuade parents and students to return to school in August? And instead of saying, what would you say to encourage them, he said just the opposite. He said, I would tell you, this is Dr. Anthony Fauci, that in this case, the idea of having treatments available or a vaccine to facilitate the reentry of students into the fall term would be something of a bridge too far. Of course, if you've ever seen the movie Bridge Too Far, that's where you were trying, as the Allied, to take too many bridges from the Nazis and were not able to do so. That's where that phrase comes from. And he added the drug that has shown some degree efficacy was modest and was used in hospitalized patients. The implication he's making is to use that as a prophylactic is not going to happen. And, of course, at least the argument from Dr. Anthony Fauci is probably not going to have kids in the school in the fall. Now, again, you might disagree with that. You're welcome to do so, but I think it also brings us back to something else that I wrote about yesterday in the article on Harvard and homeschools, which I pointed out that Harvard University's magazine basically had an article blasting homeschool as dangerous and even arguing of the risks of homeschooling and disturbed that parents can exercise authoritarian control over their kids. Well, we're kind of locked down to homeschool for the near future. By the way, some of you yesterday looking at that article that we posted also pointed out, if you were paying attention to that particular homeschool article, that the word mathematics was misspelled. Well, that wasn't our misspelling. That was from the cover of Harvard magazine. You can go back to Harvard and homeschool. It has Bible, has reading, it has writing, and the word mathematics is misspelled. Now, I've had some people suggest maybe that was done intentionally. I don't think so. I just honestly think that Harvard didn't know how to spell the word mathematics. Anyway, it was kind of interesting to see that. Anyway, that was yesterday's column. And my argument, which I was making at the time, was simply the fact that, given the fact that right now, while we are kind of homeschooling our kids, there are two things I've talked about on the air that I think are happening simultaneously. Number one, I think parents are starting to realize, if nothing else, the difficulty that teachers have in educating their kids. I've seen some bumper stickers saying, you teachers are lying. Oh, these kids are not a pleasure to teach, and so the first thing they've obviously learned is that the teachers are working very hard to keep these kids engaged and to educate them. But the second, and the point I really want to make as we take a break, is they're also recognizing how much better the child's behavior is when at home and away from some of the negative influences in the public schools. My wife and I walk every single day, usually twice a day. We didn't today because it was raining, but most of the time we are walking twice a day. And we meet the kids out there, some of them sitting on the sidewalk of chalking various things in the sidewalk, or some of them are on various kinds of wheels, whether it is bicycles or whether it's skateboards or whatever. And we have noticed that all of them have a very nice demeanor. They're all kind of interacting with their parents and with some of the other kids in the neighborhood. And I think it maybe explains a little bit why Harvard University felt the need, first of all, to have the cover article about the risks of homeschooling. And they're also going to, in June, have a conference, a symposium, I guess it's what it's called, which will bring experts together raising the alarm about the dangers of homeschooling, because they recognize that there are a lot of parents who are starting to conclude that, this idea of having kids at home, that's actually worked out pretty well. I notice the behavior of my kids maybe even improving over what we had when they were in school, and maybe some of them might actually conclude that homeschooling is actually better for their kids. So if nothing else, that is one of the comments being made by Dr. Anthony Fauci. He also said that he believes that maybe we are undercounting the number of people with the coronavirus. So when we come back to that, I want to address that issue. It brings me back to a commentary that I wrote back in April 23rd, but it also relates to something Tim Wildman and I have been interacting with. So we'll talk about that right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a recent column, Dennis Prager argues that we're seeing a dress rehearsal for a police state. Although I think he makes a convincing case, I'm intrigued by people's response to it. Some people see it, while others do not. It's like watching people look at an optical illusion. Some people see it, others do not. Prager argues that our country is closer to a police state than ever before, and he hastens to add that the police state does not mean a totalitarian state. We still have freedoms, as evidenced by the fact that he could write his column, but he says there are 4 hallmarks of a police state. First are draconian laws depriving citizens of elementary civil rights. Over the last few weeks, I cannot even count the number of times I've talked about draconian policies or extreme policies issued by governors, mayors, and judges. Americans have been banned from going to work, meeting in groups, and going to beaches and parks. Second is a mass media supportive of the state's messaging and deprivation of rights. We see that in the harsh reaction to asking questions about the value of certain policies and the decision by big tech to remove posts considered misinformation. Third is the use of police. We've seen people being handcuffed for playing ball with their children in a park or beach. We've seen people being fined for sitting on a beach or listening to a sermon in their parked cars with the windows rolled up. And fourth is the presence of snitches. One governor even set up a snitch line so that you could turn in your fellow citizens. As I've said, many see these as police state tactics. Others, however, respond that these are merely temporary and pose no threat to our liberty. That may be true, but it is shocking how willing Americans have been to conform to what might not have even been allowed a few months ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, just talk about one other aspect of the conversation that the United States Senate had with Dr. Anthony Fauci. If you kind of peel away all of the accusations and statements about this is a disaster and Trump is doing a bad job, and then some of the people that question some of the comments being made by Anthony Fauci, he does make some statement that would be worth trying to, if you will, figure out for just a minute, because he has said on more than one occasion that we may be undercounting the number of deaths from COVID-19. And it relates very much not only to something he's said, but also Tim Wildman sent me something by the name of Gunnar Steele, 3 ways they lie about COVID-19 deaths. And I think all of us are getting a little weary of the left-right tribalism. In other words, if we think that we are getting an undercount, which is oftentimes what is portrayed by the various liberal press, and that would be certainly the New York Times and others, then you certainly would applaud what Anthony Fauci has to say. If you think we're getting an overcount and we're counting too many individuals, then you would obviously be very frustrated by that and maybe point to Dr. Deborah Birx, who recently pointed out that oftentimes they count as victims of the pandemic anybody that tests positive for COVID or the coronavirus. And so in some respects, what I've tried to explain in the past is just because you die with the virus doesn't mean you died from the virus. But nevertheless, let's try to sort those out. Why would people say that there's an undercount? Well, there's very good reasons for that. One of those reasons has to do with the fact that a number of people, before this was even identified as a major pandemic, were dying at home, and they were never tested. We also have individuals in terms of dying in a hospital or nursing home, but the medical examiners were overburdened because they were in one of the nation's hot spots, so we never confirmed those. And, of course, as you well know, we've talked on this program about a while back, the New York City added another 3,700 people to their death tolls because they presumed that they died from the virus. So that's at least a possibility. The undercount is certainly one thing that you see in the news. What about the overcount? Well, I just gave you one illustration of that overcount, and that is the fact that we have a number of individuals that if they even are tested positive for COVID-19, then we assume they died of it, and they're listed in that category. This individual, Gunnar Steele, points out that if you even look at the test, oftentimes people will test positive even if they don't have COVID-19 for reasons that we don't need to get into the details of virology and epidemiology. But I also, even when you hear that, want to come back and point out that my column that is coming out tomorrow, well, later this week, I should say, points out that we also have, in some cases, people that are testing negative that actually are positive, and the best example of that is one I've mentioned on the program and is in the commentary coming out later this week, in which at the Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio, they had 239 known positive samples. These where they knew that these are individuals and the samples that are indeed people that have the virus. And when they used the test, they found, guess what? It worked about 85% of the time. Put another way, there were 15% of the people, if they used this test, that would go away saying, I don't have the virus, when they really did. And so that's one issue. But then later on, I point out one scientific paper. Again, it's not peer-reviewed, so it could be mistaken. But one paper, it concedes that the test maybe is closer to 60%. And there are all sorts of good reasons for that, and that is the fact that sometimes they don't stick the swab all the way down the nasal capacity, or the chemical reagents don't react appropriately, and you end up with that. All that to simply say that we, for some time, have assumed that some of the numbers that we have are pretty accurate. We've known the ones from China were not accurate, but now we are even beginning to question some of that as well. But the sad reality is that both of those things could be equally true at the same time, but most people on their camps only see what they want to see. That's called, of course, confirmation bias. I see only what I want to see, I hear what I only want to hear, and if nothing else, it as an illustration that we still don't know a lot about some of the numbers and even the infection rates of a disease that has really begun to affect us in dramatic ways because, if nothing else, the lockdowns. Which brings me to one of my first articles that we have posted here today. It is from our friends at the Wall Street Journal. And then I also have one from John Stonestreet, and a good friend of this ministry as well, who look at what is called Caesar, God, and the lockdowns. And the point that the editors, first of all, are making are the fact that you have a number of governors. We'll pick on Kentucky for the moment, just for the interest of this. Andy Beshear, who is the governor of Kentucky, had such a lockdown that there were all sorts of court cases. Many of those came either from our friends at First Liberty Institute or from Alliance Defending Freedom. And so what you have now are a couple of rulings by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit, which were unanimous rulings. You know, it's hard to get judges in the Circuit Court of Appeals or even in the Supreme Court to even agree that the sky is blue, much less that they can agree on something. But these were unanimous. And let me just read from one of those. This one comes from the Sixth Circuit. It's not easy to determine what is Caesar's and what is God's. You know, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar, render unto God the things that are God's. That's how they use that phrase. And that's assuredly true, they say, in the context of a pandemic. That said, the governor has offered no good reason so far for refusing to trust the congregants who promise to use care in worship in just the same way it trusts accountants, lawyers, and laundromat workers to do the same. Are they not often the same people going to work on one day and attending worship on the other? And a lot of that has to do with the fact that what you would have is the opportunity for law firms, laundromats, liquor stores to actually come together out of lockdown, but not churches. And I thought the argument from those were pretty very significant. And here's another comparison. Why is it safe to wait in a car for a liquor store to open, but dangerous to wait in a car to hear morning prayers? In another decision that came down about 7 days later, the Sixth Circuit Court also took on another case in which they said, assuming all the same precautions are taken, why can someone safely walk down a grocery store aisle but not a pew? While the law may take periodic naps during a pandemic, we will not let it sleep through this one. So it was kind of interesting to see some of these interesting decisions coming down by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And if nothing else, John Stonestreet, in his most recent column on Breakpoint, points out that, again, the decision that was made about some of these other cases, he now looks at the state of Illinois, in which, again, the lawsuit asks, keeping liquor stores open but indefinitely shutting down churches and religious ministries, the argument made from the Thomas More Society, violates our Constitution and our most basic liberties. If liquor stores are essential, so are churches. And he points out that even in Kansas, you have the governor there, Laura Kelly, exempted 26 types of secular activities from its gathering ban, but specifically prohibited churches and other religious services or activities with 10 or more people, even if they obeyed social distancing requirements. And so it brings us back to one of the points that John Stonestreet makes, in which he quotes from Robert George, who is the professor there at Princeton, because what they have found is that we live in a society today where we no longer think that church attendance is important or certainly essential. And Robert George put it this way: too many Americans, including lawmakers and even Christians, essentially see religion as a hobby, like football or going to the ballet or collecting stamps. And these things, of course, are non-essential. So the point he's making is that because we no longer see church as important, as no longer, even many times Christians no longer think church attendance is essential, it's much easier for these particular rulings to come down. And so if nothing else, we'll probably revisit this conversation on Friday. We'll have Penna Dexter and Kelly Shackelford in studio with us, and we'll talk about some of this. But it is, I think, striking that when you look at Kentucky, when you look at Illinois, when you look at Kansas, of course, when you look in California and New York and others, the assumption is that we can close down the churches because, after all, these are not essential services or functions. And yet, of course, as we've pointed out, oftentimes those churches and Christian organizations are reaching out to the poor, reaching out to the shut-ins, and providing some very important services that sometimes are ignored by secular politicians in the governor's office. Let's take a break. We have a lot more to cover. We will do so right after this.
When you gift a point of view, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penna Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let me just give you a program note. In about a half an hour, on the top of the hour, we'll be talking with Representative Van Taylor. We'll be talking about his attempt to try to put together a National Stockpile Oversight Commission so that next time we need masks, PPEs of all sorts, we'll be able to do so. Also want to ask him about one of these pieces of legislation that has been introduced. I don't think it's going to go anywhere, but it was a piece of legislation that would allow government officials to go into anyone's home and force test them for COVID-19. Some people have been expressing concerns about that and been told to sign a petition. And I said, first of all, consider who wrote this particular bill. Representative Bobby Rush, he's never been able to get a bill passed as far as I can know, a very radical Democrat out of Chicago. But nevertheless, that's one of those things people want to ask about, and I want to answer those questions as well. So we'll spend some time with him. Then Walter Brueggemann with us as we talk about his new book, Virus as a Summons to Faith. Looking at the Old Testament, there were times when we had a pandemic, we had pestilence. How did that relate? How do we think about this from a biblical point of view? And I think that will be an interesting conversation with him. And then in the third hour, David and Kathleen Ingerson will be with us as we talk about the Caleb years. Very sad story, but nevertheless one that may be very relevant to some of the things we're going through right now. So that just is a little bit of an overview. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, one of the columns that I posted here, God, Caesar, and Lockdowns, there's another one called Baseball Antibody Study. This really doesn't have a lot to do with the Major League Baseball, other than I think it just illustrates, again, we're not going to be playing baseball this year, and I think that's pretty easy to see. But let's, if we can, learn from this, because one of the things that has been done by the leaders in Major League Baseball is they've actually subjected as many employees as they can to see how many of those individuals might have antibodies. And so the study now of nearly 6,000 Major League Baseball employees, and so we're talking about all sorts of people, not just the individuals that are maybe out there throwing a baseball or hitting it, but also all sorts of other individuals that are working in the front office and people that are selling things and all the rest. And so after looking at 6,000 employees going through a very expensive set of tests, they concluded that the number of people testing positive for antibodies, 0.7%. Now, to understand what that means is that for people that have always been talking about this idea of herd immunity, never liked the term, that's what it's called, so we'll just have to use that term. That is, if a good number of people get the virus and then develop the antibodies for it, we sort of can set it aside. And the reality is that this number is lower than anybody would have expected. Let's think of a couple of other examples. There was a study that was done by the University of Florida, and that's done of about a significant number of people in the Miami-Dade County, and they found maybe about 6% testing positive. The highest number I've seen was one that we've mentioned before, and I will mention again when I look at another article in just a minute, and that is for those in New York City, about 20% of people in New York City tested positive for antibodies. And you might remember some of the studies that came out of Santa Clara County, because that's in California. There was a real attempt to try to get a pretty systematic study, and that was, again, they figured between about 2.5% to 4%. But the point is, it's nowhere near what would be the threshold for what is called herd immunity. And so it really, I think, illustrates only so well that we are not even getting close to the possibility of considering these individuals to be safe without a vaccine. Again, recognizing that a good percentage of the individuals that get the disease are asymptomatic, and then the percentage of those who do show symptoms, some have to go to the hospital, and then a percentage of those have to go into ICU, and some of those individuals die. Some of those are on ventilators for weeks. But if nothing else, it illustrates, again, kind of what we are dealing with right now. And so this brings me to a very good piece that came out by Scott Gottlieb. You might remember I've mentioned his name before. He's now a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, but was, of course, the commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. And he points out in this particular piece that there are two kinds of immunity. The first is what you call innate immunity, which comes from circulating cells that attack any invader that the body views as foreign. And that is, of course, how most of us fight off various kinds of colds, flus, and a variety of other things. We get the antibodies for it. Then there is the adaptive immunity, which is specific to the pathogen, and this is where the immune cells are programmed to secrete antibodies that are primed to target that particular invader, and that's, of course, where various kinds of things like a vaccine or like transferring plasma from another individual might actually do this. But nevertheless, as we pointed out just a few minutes ago, the antibody surveys conducted by New York City in April showed, I guess the actual number is 21% of New Yorkers already have antibodies to COVID-19. And so that number may now be higher. There are some that are predicting that as the epidemic has run its course through maybe June, that number could reach about 1/3. But again, still pretty low, not high enough. Most people would assume for what is oftentimes called herd immunity. So that's the particular situation there. And this particular article also surfaces one other issue. He says, while all of the tests can generate false positives, a finding that you have antibodies when you don't, the risk can be sharply reduced by repeating the test if it comes back positive. A predictive value of 2 consecutive positive tests is high enough for you to be confident that the antibodies are present. So what we're seeing is the idea that we can finally maybe let people out, or that we could create this idea. Remember, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago when we had Deborah Georgiadis in here, of immunity passports. That was all based upon the idea that people would have antibodies and they would have immunity. And the reality is, so far, we don't. All that to simply say that we're far away from herd immunity. I think this study done of the Major League Baseball tells us we're not going to be playing baseball this year, which is sad for those of us that especially wanted to go to that new stadium, that new ballpark there in Arlington. But nevertheless, I am sorry, I'm just the bearer of bad news today. But let's, before we end the break, talk about some good news. And this comes from Francis Collins. Francis Collins is a fellow Christian, evangelical. He is the head of the National Institute of Health. And he is, by the way, 7 years of age, a physician, a geneticist, has really overseen everything from the Human Genome Project. Just a brilliant individual, to put it mildly. But nevertheless, some people have asked, what about a vaccine? Now, he's always the optimist, so I do love this. He said, my expectation is, I'm a bit optimist, that we won't find just one vaccine, but we might find maybe 2 or 3 vaccines that come through the trials looking as though they're safe and effective. They'll have somewhat different characteristics of where they work best, so we might need, as he points out, to do some matching of the vaccine to particular populations. And so his argument is that any vaccine we come up with, any pharmaceutical you come up with, some work better in some circumstances than others. Almost all of them have what are called contraindications, or effects that are not necessarily positive. So there is a real possibility that we might come up with more than one vaccine. Today, Dr. Anthony Fauci was talking about one that seemed promising. He didn't really say what it was. By the other day, when we were on Friday with Dr. Merrill Matthews, he talked about remdesivir. Well, that's really not a vaccine. That's just really more of a treatment for people that already have the disease. But nevertheless, we're seeing some things that work, but nothing that so far is the perfect solution, the silver bullet, or whatever you might want to call it. But if indeed the optimism of Francis Collins is true, he believes that they might be able to have as many as 10 million doses by the fall, maybe up to 100 million doses by late fall, maybe 300 million by January. But again, you can see, if you're still convinced that we're going to get back to normal, don't you think most parents are going to want their kids to have the vaccine before they put them in school? And since we have quite a few millions of people here, even having 10 million vaccine doses in the fall, which is, I think, very optimistic, maybe too optimistic, and even 100 million by the end of the fall, still not quite there for everybody having the vaccine. But nevertheless, that's about the most optimistic thing I can find today. Let's come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was a warm spring Thursday evening in Greenville, Mississippi. One would have said it was a perfectly normal evening for King James Bible Baptist Church to host a Bible study, but things were hardly normal. A highly communicable virus had infected the world. Everyone was shut down, or so it seemed. The town's mayor had even canceled all gatherings in the town, including religious gatherings. Still, Pastor Charles Hamilton made adjustments and readied himself to preach to a bunch of cars. Well, he meant to preach to people, but they were confined to their cars. That week, the mayor of Greenville had even prohibited so-called drive-in church services where parishioners drove to the church, parked in the lot, and stayed in their cars, listening through the closed doors and windows to hear Pastor Hamilton preach. It was a strange time. Nonetheless, Pastor Hamilton was shocked when he walked outside. The entire police force was there, piling out of their cruisers. One officer rushed to inform Pastor Hamilton that his rights had been suspended. Pastor Hamilton thanked the officer, picked up his Bible, and continued to preach anyway. Now, we don't know what the officers thought about the sermon that evening, but we do know this. It took 2 lawsuits and the intervention of the Attorney General of the United States to get to Greenville's mayor to stop discriminating against Pastor Hamilton. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
And for a few more minutes, let me just mention that in about 15 minutes, we're going to be talking with Representative Van Taylor and getting some perspective on what is happening in Congress. They're going to be meeting again. I believe Thursday is when they are actually bringing everybody back to the House. Of course, you already have the Senate hearing today with Anthony Fauci. But I thought for just a minute before we have him on, talk about China. Yesterday, if you were listening to the program, we had Curtis Ellis on, and we were talking about 2 ways in which you can maybe express your opinion. One is to vote in November for individuals that want to do something about China. And if you are having individuals running for Congress and you ask them about China and they start defending China or not really talking about doing anything to deal with China, I think you already have an answer to the fact that they're probably making some money from China, or in one way or another, China has influenced them and they're not going to represent you very well. So certainly of all, you can vote in that way, but you can also, as he talked about at the end, vote another way, and that is to boycott China. As a matter of fact, that may be the only way to send the signal to things like Wall Street and some of the bureaucrats that are quite willing to ignore even what happens in the election and continue to support China. And our article by him yesterday illustrates that some people have a vested interest, some people may be naive, but nevertheless, there are some ways in which you can maybe influence what is happening out of China simply by how you vote and what you buy. But let's, if we can, look at another issue that is now surfaced. Gary Bauer's end-of-day report yesterday reminds us that now German intelligence reports that they are convinced that the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, personally intervened with Dr. Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who is the director of the World Health Organization, to delay the release of critical information related to the COVID-19 outbreak in China. We suspected as much. In some respects, the connection between China and the World Health Organization seemed to be one-to-one, and now you have the German media and the German intelligence agencies confirming that as well. Specifically, according to this report that appeared in the media outlet Der Spiegel, demanded that the World Health Organization not release information about human-to-human transmission, remember that we've talked about before, and that the World Health Organization delay the declaration of a global pandemic. Der Spiegel also goes on to say that their intelligence community say the verdict is harsh. At least 4, if not 6 weeks have been lost as a result of the delaying tactics that came from the communist Chinese government, and in particular from the Chinese President Xi Jinping. So there you go. We suspected as much. Now it's pretty much documented in Der Spiegel. By the way, it'll be interesting to see how well that gets covered by the New York Times, Washington Post. Hopefully it'll be covered by Washington Times or Fox News or a few others, but nevertheless, that's the case. Meanwhile, Gary Bauer continues that we have a fairly significant amount of evidence, which, again, let's give credit where credit is due. The mainstream press has covered this, that hackers from China and Iran have been attempting to steal valuable intellectual property and public health data through all sorts of illicit means, because they're trying to figure out maybe what we've been able to develop in terms of vaccines, treatments, and testing. So at the same time that the Chinese communists, Gary Bauer says, are engaged in a global propaganda campaign to convince the world that the virus originated from the U.S. military, we also have them digging deeply into some of the American secrets to see if they can benefit from some of the intellectual property. And anybody that would think that if we were to develop a vaccine, we wouldn't share that with the world is, I think, very naive, or just, again, convinced that we are an evil empire ourselves. So anyway, Gary Bauer concludes by saying this. On every front, China is being exposed for what it is, what it did, and what it did not do and should have done. Some sleepwalking European countries, he said, have apparently been awakened, and that would be, of course, Germany, with the articles in Der Spiegel. But here in the United States, he said there are many places where China doesn't have to apply any pressure because the left carries the communist Chinese water. Our left-wing media have little interest in exposing China's role in this pandemic. They dismiss stories regarding the German intelligence report. We'll see how this plays out over the next couple of days. Yet the same media obsessed over a call between our president and the president of Ukraine. They think Attorney General Bill Barr is a threat to justice and rule of law, while Beijing's communist bosses get a free pass. Gary Bauer's a little bit upset about that, as you can imagine. And then he points out one other thing that we've talked about as well. America's colleges and universities, another institution controlled by the left, have allowed what are called Confucius Institutes to thrive on their campuses after bribes from Beijing. These institutes now have been pretty much exposed as centers of espionage and places where Chinese propaganda is being presented. And he says apparently there are no progressives on Capitol Hill, and he's got a HTML link to that so you can see the list, have any interest in joining a bipartisan effort to counter Chinese communist threat to our country. And that gets back to some of the legislation that we've been talking about. Certainly Chip Roy in the House, Tom Cotton in the Senate, and a variety of others. I always forget to mention that Marco Rubio and a variety of others, not to mention, of course, Ted Cruz, and all sorts of people are pushing this legislation. But finally, he says, exposing communist China and the danger it poses to American economic and national interest and security is important. And he says, calling out the regime's human rights abuses, responsibility for the COVID epidemic, the theft of American jobs, and spying on our college campuses should reunite us. But that doesn't seem to be taking place. So, if nothing else, just a little bit more on China. And if you've always wanted an excuse for why you would not want to buy Chinese products, there you go. Why you would want to know where people stand on this. And to me, one of the wake-up calls was, of all things, the NBA. When you have the general manager for the Houston Rockets saying something about China, and then everybody out of the woodwork come to criticize him, I'm thinking, whoa. It maybe shows the extent of Chinese influence in this country. Let's just, before we take a break, encourage you to go to a couple of the articles that we have posted today, because we have quite a few that give you some documentation for some of the things I've been talking about. Also, my Viewpoints commentary today is on the police state. It's really where there was a column recently by Dennis Prager arguing that this might look like a dress rehearsal for the police state. And by that, he doesn't mean we're a totalitarian state. Obviously, we still have freedom. But he said there are 4 characteristics of a police state. And if you look down, all 4 of them in one way or another have manifested themselves. And the point I make is not that we are or not a police state. It's just the fact that even as he makes the case, you have some people looking at it going, I don't see that at all. These are just, very temporary. There's no threat to liberty. And I say it's kind of like sometimes when you put an optical illusion. Some people see it, some people don't. And maybe that is the case. Maybe these are all just temporary, but we're certainly seeing a lot of resistance from some of the governors to open up the lockdown. And if nothing else, as I conclude the commentary, I point out that we as Americans are going along with a lot of things which if 6 months ago I told you we would be having to actually endure, you would have probably thought I'd lost my mind. And yet look at where we are right now. And we've given you some examples of that just in the last hour. But let's take a break. Representative Van Taylor is concerned that we don't have shortages in the future. So let's have a commission to have oversight over our national stockpile. And what about some of the pieces of legislation being proposed right now in the House of Representatives? We'll talk about that with him. Then we'll talk about whether the virus might be a summons to faith from Walter Brueggemann. So we've got a lot more to cover, and we will do that right after these important messages.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week. in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining us on the Tuesday edition of Point of View. Dr. Anthony Fauci actually testified today before the Senate and actually brought some bad news for those of you that were hoping that your kids might go back to school in the fall. He believes that we may still be homeschooling our kids in the fall. Of course, we'll see whether or not that plans out to be the case. But nevertheless, one of the very insightful kinds of comments that came today as he was interacting with Senator Lamar Alexander, who, by the way, is the chair of the Senate Committee on Health, Education, and Labor, and suggesting that it might just be too difficult to get kids back to school in the fall. So we'll see where that plays out and talk about that a little bit later. But I thought it would be good for you to know what's been going on behind the scenes. And one of those things is there is an attempt to try to put together a commission to really look at the strategic national stockpile. We recognize that the loss of some of these PPEs, the lack of attention to that is really important. So I wanted to bring to the microphone an individual that I've interviewed on a number of occasions in the past, Representative Van Taylor, businessman, decorated Iraqi war veteran, and an individual that serves in the 3rd Congressional District of the state of Texas. And so, Van Taylor, always great to have you on the program with us.
Great to be on with you, Kerby, and hello to all your great listeners out there.
Let's, if we can, talk about this. You are actually sponsoring a bipartisan bill, so we'll give credit for a member of Congress from Colorado who's a Democrat. You're a Republican, of course. And it really looks at this idea of looking at the shortcomings, because as you go back and look, we allocated a fair amount of money, and we supposedly had a number of those kinds of masks and other PPE necessary. But then when push came to shove, we didn't have those. And so your argument and this bill would actually establish a commission. Tell us more, if you might.
Sure. So I think you sort of begin with there was a national stockpile that was set up long ago for the military. And I believe in 1998, when President Clinton found out it was only for the military, said we need to make that, we need to stockpile something for civilians. And he was able to allocate a few $100 million for that in 1998. President Bush, who you may know, but he was a big reader. He loved to read books. He read a lot of. He had a reading competition actually with Karl Rove, and they would actually have a weekly update in a spreadsheet of who had read the most books for a year. They had a competition between the two of them. And one of the books he read was a book about the Spanish flu pandemic in 1919. It was a book written by Michael Berry in 2005. It was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book. Anyway, he read that book and said, we need to make the strategic stockpile robust. So he was able to appropriate several $1 billion to build a very robust strategic stockpile that was used during the Obama administration for H1N1, wasn't really kind of brought back up to stuff. In other words, we didn't refill it as much as probably we as Americans should have. But that was a very important. The infrastructure was set up, and that was used in a very important infrastructure for handling this pandemic. And I think that there's certainly a lot for us as Americans to learn about this particular pandemic. Studying the strategic stockpile how it was used, and how we can improve it, I think is something that's really important for us as Americans to understand and for Congress to understand. Excuse me, my dog in the background. So that's what we're looking at trying to fix.
Yes. Well, again, everybody's sheltered at home, although I understand you're going to be heading back to Congress. Aren't there some votes coming up or some testimony taking place later this week? What's going to happen here in Congress in the next couple of days? Well, I think I lost him. So there you go.
We're just going to find out within the hour, that we are going to be coming back to Congress, to Washington to vote on Friday. The Democrats dropped an 1,815-page bill, which disappointingly has had there's been no consultation or negotiation with the Republicans on this bill as far as I'm aware. I don't know any member that said, yeah, I had a chance to talk to them about this or that. So unfortunately, it's a one-sided bill. And you'll forgive me, I've only read the first 15 pages of it. So I'll be reading later in the night, trying to get bits and pieces of what's in here. But it's a doozy. It's a big bill. It's a long bill, and I'm not sure what the total price tag on it is, but so far it's in the tens of billions. I haven't gotten all the way to the end to see where the real spending is.
And what's oftentimes happens on some of those bills we've talked about in the past is that all sorts of things are added in. The idea that we should allow people to be able to register on Election Day and vote on Election Day, mail-in votes, all sorts of things like that, as well as all sorts of funding of various kinds of union activities, all of which is supposedly there so that we can bring the economy back to some kind of stability. But as I've said before, it's like all sorts of attempts to put new ornaments on a Christmas tree and then get it passed in a rush to say, well, we need to deal with the pandemic. And then when you have 1,800 pages of bills, you can't even begin to understand the logical implications of all of that, can you?
Sure. No, it's very difficult to understand something of that size. But let me just circle back and just talk quickly about commissions and their role.
Good idea.
After 9/11, we had a commission that really looked at 9/11 from the beginning to the end, and so there is a discussion in Congress, and I have this discussion on a regular basis of if we were to structure commissions, how would it be? Will we do a National Stockpile Commission and then a Pharmaceutical Supply Chain Commission and a PPE Commission, a Response Commission? Do we look at how to prevent a future pandemic commission, or do we have one big, huge one that then has a whole bunch of silos it's got to go into? So there's a discussion about that. But the fact is, you want to study these things, you want to understand them, you want to do it on a bipartisan basis, and I think it's important. This is just my own perspective: is you want to have members of Congress on it because they're going to have to go and implement that into law. To have a commission done by an outside party, then come to Congress and say, look, here are our recommendations. We think they're good recommendations. You don't necessarily have the buy-in of the people that are actually going to be implementing it into law. And I saw this in my time, Kerby, in the state legislature,
yes,
where we had a sunset commission, and that had 12 members, 5 state senators, 5 state House members, and then one outside expert or a civilian expert on either side, one for the House, appointed by the Speaker of the House, one appointed by the Lieutenant Governor of the state of Texas. But by having 5 senators and 5 House members, you had the people automatically who would carry the legislation that they had looked at, recommended, and thought through, who would then say, look, I was on this commission. These are our recommendations. They were able to implement them. And so if you want a successful commission, you have one that's implementable, and that means having legislators who can carry the legislation through the end to change particular laws, or to build new systems, or to tweak existing systems.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue for just a few more minutes with Representative Van Taylor. If you're interested, first of all, we have a link to his website, but we have a separate article on the National Stockpile Oversight Commission. And if you'd like to know the legislation, it's H.R. 6641. And so we have all sorts of information about that on the website in case you'd like to contact your member of Congress about this. We'll take a break and continue our conversation right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a recent column, Dennis Prager argues that we're seeing a dress rehearsal for a police state. Although I think he makes a convincing case, I'm intrigued by people's response to it. Some people see it while others do not. It's like watching people look at an optical illusion. Some people see it, others do not. Prager argues that our country is closer to a police state than ever before, and he hastens to add that the police state does not mean a totalitarian state. We still have freedoms, as evidenced by the fact that he could write his column, but he says there are 4 hallmarks of a police state. First are draconian laws depriving citizens of elementary civil rights. Over the last few weeks, I cannot even count the number of times I've talked about draconian policies or extreme policies issued by governors, mayors, and judges. Americans have been banned from going to work, meeting in groups, and going to beaches and parks. Second is a mass media supportive of the state's messaging and deprivation of rights. We see that in the harsh reaction to asking questions about the value of certain policies and the decision by big tech to remove posts considered misinformation. Third is the use of police. We've seen people being handcuffed for playing ball with their children in a park or beach. We've seen people being fined for sitting on a beach or listening to a sermon in their parked cars with the windows rolled up. And fourth is the presence of snitches. One governor even set up a snitch line so that you could turn in your fellow citizens. As I've said, many see these as police state tactics. Others, however, respond that these are merely temporary and pose no threat to our liberty. That may be true, but it is shocking how willing Americans have been to conform to what might not have even been allowed a few months ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Representative Van Taylor, representing the 3rd Congressional District in the state of Texas. And if you got something to write with, as we mentioned before, this bipartisan bill, one of the sponsors is Van Taylor. The other one is Joe Neguse up there in Colorado. And those individuals, one Republican, one Democrat, and others, want to establish a federal commission to address the shortcomings of the Strategic National Stockpile. And it is something where you would have a bipartisan commission that would assess, strategize, and even issue recommendations. And as Van Taylor just pointed out, since some of those individuals would indeed be in Congress, they would then be able to carry that legislation. And this is something that has been one of those points that has been illustrated only so well by this virus pandemic and the need for us to make sure that we have the supplies and resources necessary for something in the future. So, Van Taylor, this is H.R. 6641. I think you would encourage some of our listeners, since we are broadcasting now to about 42 different states, to contact their legislator, their representative, and encourage them to become a co-sponsor or to move the legislation forward.
Sure. No, I think having a bipartisan commission, makes sense. That's the way to do it. I think you want to have legislators on there, so those are the people that are going to actually carry the bill into law. And this is, again, one of several areas that I and other members of Congress are talking about. And I think that we're going to continue to have a conversation about whether we have a series of siloed commissions, right? So this would be a silo. You're looking just at the Strategic National Stockpile. or if you say, you know, we're going to have one huge overarching commission that handles a series of different issues. And this is important, I think, again, to make sure, and we did this after 9/11. This is not a new idea. There have been many commissions that have studied many different issues. I remember in my time in the state legislature, there was a concern about anesthesia-related deaths in dentist's office, and we called for a blue ribbon panel to go and just take a deep dive into that. And that took them about 2 months. They looked at that one specific problem and came back with some pretty good recommendations that really helped us understand the problem and kind of take the hype away and just, hey, look at everything, figure it out, come back to us, give us an answer, and we can act from that. So that's the object here, and it is. I think it's good policy, and it makes good sense to really study these things. And I think we're going to have to look at, you know, not just the stockpile. We're going to have to look at our supply chains. Do we want to have our supply chains in China and other countries? Do we want to have some of those back in the United States? There's a strong penchant. I'm certainly one of those people that believes this. We need to move our sources for pharmaceutical research, for the manufacturer of pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter medications. We need to have more of that manufactured in the United States, such that we can be independent and not have to rely on imports to make sure that we have the drugs to keep our country healthy.
And I might just mention that we've already given you an action item for that. It is one that came out on the 15th of April. It was entitled Protecting Our Pharmaceutical Supply Chain. So if you go to pointofview.net, the middle section there, take action, go to the second one. And that was where we were encouraging you to contact your two senators about this particular piece of legislation by Senator Tom Cotton. We've been thinking about doing another one in terms of the House because Representative Chip Roy and others have some similar legislation. And, of course, Marco Rubio and a variety of others have been all addressing that issue. So that is certainly the case. So, again, H.R. 6641, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a piece of legislation which I'm sure is going nowhere, but I've seen all sorts of publicity about it, petitions and all of that. And that's H.R. 6666. First of all, you have to laugh at that, by Representative Bobby Rush. And everybody, you know, is getting these petitions saying, you know, this is a particular piece of legislation would allow government officials to enter anyone's home and force them to be tested for COVID-19 and on and on and on. And first of all, I think you would agree with me that Representative Bobby Rush hasn't been real successful in getting any of his legislation passed. And I don't think that's a particular piece of legislation that is generating all sorts of petitions and letters and Snopes evaluations. I don't think that piece of legislation is going anywhere. But what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that let me just kind of step back and sort of take the positive side of this coin and say, you know, contact tracing is an important aspect of beating back a pandemic. I remember in 2014 when I was in the Texas legislature and the initial patient zero in the United States for Ebola was in Dallas, Texas. Actually, he presented and actually sadly died in the same hospital where my youngest daughter was born. We ended up using contact tracing, and we actually had home quarantine 1,000 people for one infected. In this particular epidemic, we began with a much smaller number of people who were quarantined. In my county, in Collin County, Texas, the county health department has built their own software for contact tracing. They have volunteers that are work for the county that have volunteered to help in the contact tracing effort. And so they have several score people that are working full time, trying to contact people and say, hey, you were exposed to the coronavirus. You need to home quarantine until you know that you're clear. And so in this particular instance, we've gone from where we had one person quarantined for every 5 active cases in Collin County, where we now have 5 people quarantined for every active case in Collin County. So I think we've built that up, and that's strictly on a voluntary basis. I think that is in a way that's thoughtful. If you look at what they did in South Korea, so South Korea probably has one of a very advanced contact tracing system. They've actually used cell phone data, databases that I think that most Americans would find too invasive, that would really violate what we believe are our Fourth Amendment rights to freedom of search and seizure without probable cause. And so I think it's unacceptable. But I think that it's important to kind of look at that model, knowing that, you know what, this is not something that we could really do in this country, and it's not something that I would want to do. I'm a big believer in civil liberties and protecting people's Fourth Amendment rights. But you want to look at that and then understand, well, what can we do? Where is there a middle ground? How can we make sure that we have an effective contract tracing system at the same time that we are preserving those inalienable rights, those God-given rights that say, you know what, you have a right to you are secure in your place, in your papers and your possessions from having the government come in and start nosing around through your stuff. And that's an important concept in our country, and something that I'm certainly willing to defend.
Well, if nothing else, I appreciate the fact that you've read the first 15 pages, and maybe when you've got a little better understanding of what this is going to do, you can call us back and let us know, because it is so typical, as you and I have talked about over the years, in terms of whether we don't have a budget or everything has to be done right now. Nobody has a chance to read it, and nothing is done on a bipartisan basis, and you deserve high accolades, because on many occasions you've tried to reach across the aisle and find other individuals to introduce legislation, and this particular one, which is a good piece of legislation. The good one is H.R. 6641, and that's the one about the stockpile. And if you would like more information, we have posted it on our website, pointofview.net. Van Taylor, just before we go, any other final comments for our listeners to maybe understand what's going to happen in Congress over the next couple of days?
I think you'll. Let me just make a quick comment. That is that the federal government has responded with $3 trillion injected into the U.S. economy over the last 6 weeks. That is an incredible, unprecedented, and unparalleled achievement. I think every American should be proud of how rapidly the Congress and the president have acted, and in terms of improving, increasing unemployment benefits, in terms of lending the payroll protection plan, which has saved tens of millions of jobs, improving food stamp benefits, reducing regulation, allowing telemedicine, and stepping up to pay for testing, to pay for vaccines, to pay for PPP, personal protective equipment. The federal government has stepped up on a level that really we have never seen before in the history of our country, and that has meant a lot of work for me and my staff, and we're happy to do it, and glad that the federal government is moving quickly to address these issues. And I think that I'm optimistic for our future, and I just want to tell all my constituents out there, if you've got a problem, please reach out to my office. We're happy to help.
So again, thank you so very much for joining with us today here on Point of View. Van Taylor with us, and let's take a break. And when we come back, we're going to spend some time talking with Walter Brueggemann, and his book is entitled Virus as a Summons to Faith. How do we think about some of this? And as an expert in the Old Testament, maybe we can learn some lessons from other plagues and pandemics and pestilence in the past, and how to think about this biblically. So I think you will enjoy that conversation as well. If you'd like to know more about Representative Van Taylor, we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. We'll take a break. Have more right after this.
(2020). Is there anything important happening this year? Well, not unless you consider major disputes in various Christian denominations, international tensions over a flu epidemic, economic uncertainties, and a presidential election important. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It's easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
You know, as we go through this virus pandemic, sometimes we can get some great insight from the Old Testament, and we've talked about that in the past. We've also talked about, are there any prophetic significance to this, and how can we think about this in a way that is God-honoring, because after all, this is a time of testing for many individuals, and so we thought it would be very appropriate to identify this particular book. It's fairly short, very readable, Virus as a Summons to Faith, Biblical Reflections in a Time of Loss, Grief, and Uncertainty. And it is written by Dr. Walter Brueggemann, who, as you may know, has written quite a number of books over the years and has been serving as now the Emeritus Professor of Old Testament at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia, past president of the Society of Biblical Literature, author of such books as David and His Theologian, A Pathway to Interpretation, Embracing the Transformation, the Practice of Hopefulness, Truth-Telling as Subversive Obedience, but this one, Virus as a Summons to Faith. And Dr. Brueggemann, just a great opportunity here to maybe consider the idea of a plague, a pandemic, a pestilence in the Old Testament and see what we can learn from some of those great heroes of the faith in the Old Testament. So thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, it's nice to be with you, Kirby, and glad we have a chance to talk. Thank you.
Let's, if we can, mention that people might have seen some of this before, but some of it is new as well. And you take us through Leviticus and Exodus and 2 Samuel, Jeremiah, Kings, Psalm 77, which I thought was very insightful, Isaiah, and other passages. But again, the goal here is to just recognize that this is not the first time believers have had to face the challenges of a plague or a pestilence, right?
That is correct. And what I did was to just see how the notion of pestilence occurred in the Old Testament. I don't know that there's an exact equivalent between that notion of pestilence and our reality of virus, but I thought the linkage was close enough that you could pursue it that way, so that's what I did.
Early on, you talk about this idea of a transactional mode of covenant. You know, we've all had that idea because you look in the Old Testament, for example, and if the nation of Israel and the Jewish people were obeying God, then they would be blessed, and if they were disobeying God, he would bring sword or pestilence, disease to them. But even though that is perhaps true in the Old Testament, we do, as you just, I think, are alluding to, have to make sure we don't try to make a one-to-one comparison between some of the promises given in the Old Testament theocracy and the reality of what we face today in our 21st century world, right?
That's right. We're in a very different circumstance, and the Bible comes from a pre-scientific culture, so they didn't have the categories of analysis that we think are trustworthy. So to make the leap from that old text to our circumstance takes some imaginative interpretation, which gives you a lot of room for experimentation and playfulness. I tried to occupy some of that space.
I think so. Let's, if we can, maybe just talk about the fact that even if we recognize that just because there's a pestilence right now or a pandemic or whatever it might be, and we don't want to say that necessarily is a judgment of God. We've covered that with a number of other guests we've had on the program. It's still, whether it is something brought by God or simply as a result of living in a fallen world and a creation that groans in travail, as it says in the book of Romans, it's a time to really reassess who we are and who God is, and maybe reevaluate many of our priorities. And that seems to be a theme that runs through this book of yours.
Well, I think that's right. And I think we are able to see that our situation in the virus is causing us to look again at some of that. We now are having the odd experience of having much less air pollution because of the slowdown of our industrial machinery. Kids are not getting as sick because they're not going to school to pass it around. So we're getting a big break from many of the ailments that we have come to think of as very normal and acceptable. And I think it provides an opportunity for us to think maybe we can establish a different normal, and we don't need to go back to some of those old practices that have not always been healthy and constructive for us.
I would certainly agree. And in some respects, we're all reevaluating our priorities, and we keep hearing people saying that when we come back to normal, it will be a new normal. So that is the case. So that is part of that as well, which kind of relates to one of your chapters when you talk about Jeremiah, until the dancing begins again. We are in kind of a lockdown, starting to change a little bit. but there is a sense in which you remind us, and I had never really thought about this, that there was a time in the book of Jeremiah where there were no weddings because the corpses were piling up. And yet we've seen a couple of stories of individuals that have decided to elope, but weddings that we used to have with all the wonderful ceremony are not happening right now. Then you go a couple of verses later and Jeremiah talks about they're not even having funerals. So they're not only not having wedding feasts, they're not having funerals. And I'd kind of forgotten about that as well. And of course, we recognize that right now, if you lose a loved one, oftentimes they are cremated, or there is the plan to maybe have a celebration of their life later on, or maybe they gather just 10 people around a grave. So as I read through that chapter, I thought, wow, in the book of Jeremiah, there are some real similarities to what we're facing right now. What are your thoughts?
It's like we've been there before. And I guess I don't know that they had school graduations then, but then we're not having those now either.
Yeah.
And it really means for us the shutdown of most of our symbolic public life. And I think that, at least in the tradition of Jeremiah, he was bearing witness to a shutdown of public life, and it really raises all kinds of questions about the social fabric if you can't articulate it and celebrate it and make it visible. And I think that's the fix we're in now, and that's the fix they were in then. Exactly.
You know, we think of Jeremiah and the book of Lamentations as downers, but there is an end and the back, because he does look forward to a time when there would be celebrations. And you talk about the fact that there would be songs of thank offerings sung to God who restores. Give thanks to the Lord of hosts, to the Lord is good, for his steadfast love endures forever, which is in the last part of Jeremiah. So even though you go through some of these very kind of difficult circumstances, and like you said, we didn't necessarily have graduations back there, although maybe we had some celebrations for bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs and things like that.
Probably.
We certainly see that. And again, the cancellation of these graduations, these weddings, even these funerals, chapter 3 in your book really helps us understand that as well. And just before we take a break, we talk about also this idea of praying amidst the virus, because you have the whole section there in 1 Kings 8. And it seems to me that prayer and pestilence can actually be found in the Old Testament, can't they?
They do go together. There's a number of texts in both in Kings and in Chronicles in which the text proposes that when you get sword, famine, and pestilence, the proper response is to pray to God and to repent. So it's you always get that twofold accent. You can't just pray, but you also have to change things. And I think that's a consistent pattern in those texts.
Privileged to have with us Dr. Walter Brueggemann. We need to take a break, and when we come back, I wanted to focus a little bit of time and attention on Psalm 77, which I never really thought about before. Then maybe if we have time, we'll get into the book of Isaiah, chapter 42 and 43. But if you are interested in this book, and it's very easy read, about 80 pages, Reaping the Whirlwind looks at Leviticus and Exodus and the book of Job, of course. We also talked about a little bit about pestilence and 2 Samuel. Certainly we focused a fair amount of attention right here on this idea of until the dancing begins again in the book of Jeremiah, and then praying amidst the virus, which would be 1 Kings chapter 8. And when we come back, we want to talk about Psalm 77 and maybe some things in the book of Isaiah. And, of course, we're only covering this briefly in the short amount of time that we have with him, but I think you might find this really insightful and an opportunity to think a little bit more deeply about some of these passages maybe you've read in the past, either in a Sunday school class or maybe as you're reading through the Bible in a year, or maybe in the case, as we'll look at in just a minute, Psalm 77, maybe you've read that but never thought about its connection to what we're talking about here right now. And this is a good example of where God's Word sometimes is a fresh and a new and provides some insight because of the circumstances and the trials and tribulations we might be facing right now. So we'll continue this conversation, and if you'd like to know more about the book, Virus as a Summons to Faith, we have information, as you might imagine, on our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was a warm spring Thursday evening in Greenville, Mississippi. One would have said it was a perfectly normal evening for King James Bible Baptist Church to host a Bible study, but things were hardly normal. A highly communicable virus had infected the world. Everyone was shut down, or so it seemed. The town's mayor had even canceled all gatherings in the town, including religious gatherings. Still, Pastor Charles Hamilton made adjustments and readied himself to preach to a bunch of cars. Well, he meant to preach to people, but they were confined to their cars. That week, the mayor of Greenville had even prohibited so-called drive-in church services where parishioners drove to the church, parked in the lot, and stayed in their cars, listening through the closed doors and windows to hear Pastor Hamilton preach. It was a strange time. Nonetheless, Pastor Hamilton was shocked when he walked outside. The entire police force was there, piling out of their cruisers. One officer rushed to inform Pastor Hamilton that his rights had been suspended. Pastor Hamilton thanked the officer, picked up his Bible, and continued to preach anyway. Now, we don't know what the officers thought about the sermon that evening, but we do know this. It took 2 lawsuits and the intervention of the Attorney General of the United States to get to Greenville's mayor to stop discriminating against Pastor Hamilton. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Dr. Walter Brueggemann with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, The Virus as a Summons to Faith. We have information about that on our website. You can go to the website and find that it's available in paperback or Kindle, very inexpensive, and I think you would benefit from that. Also have a link to walterbrueggemann.com in which you can find out about all of his books, his audio, his video, his speaking, and a variety of other resources. So you don't even have to know how to spell his last name. You can simply go to pointofview.net, and that makes it very easy for you to find him. 2 G's, 2 N's in case you are trying to spell it. And let's, if we can, focus for just a few minutes on Psalm 77. And up until now, we've oftentimes pointed people to various passages in the New Testament, which would be like Philippians 4 and 1 Peter 5:7 of casting your anxieties on him, or just not having a spirit of fear, 2 Timothy 1, and others. But Psalm 77 really hadn't even been thinking about that in terms of how this might help us understand what we're going through right now. So share with us a little bit of some of the insights that you were able to glean from Psalm 77.
Thank you, Kerby. What I noticed is the shift in pronouns through the psalm.
Yes.
The first half of the psalm, which is a lament and a complaint, are dominated by first-person pronouns I, me, my, mine, and the speaker is speaking out his needs and his expectations and his rights to God in a time of trouble. And then, quite remarkably, the psalm shifts halfway through, and there is no more first-person pronoun. Now it is all second person addressed to God as you, or you, and so on. And what I got out of that is that by the time you reach the halfway through the point in the psalm, that the psalmist has come to see that he himself does not have the resources to make an adequate response to the demands in front of him, and he has to move from his self-affirmation to give himself over to the goodness of God. And I thought that in the midst of the virus, what's happening to us is that we are coming to see the inadequacy of our ability to cope with this circumstance of our life on our own. We don't have resources for that. And so it is an opportunity for us as well to be shifting our focus away from self-actualization and self-assertion and self-control and self-sufficiency toward the generosity and the goodness of God. And I thought that the psalm provides some of a map for that change that can be traced then and I think now.
You know, in those first 6 verses, I mean, we could say the same thing, you know. I need to go back to work. I need to get my kids in school. I need to be able to make an income. You know, why are you doing this to me? And so in some respects, those first 6 verses are lots of I's, lots of my and me. And then, as you point out, from verses 7 and following, then the focus is on God. And so in some respects, when this first happened, and even as it's happening now, there's a tendency to lament what is happening to me instead of to beginning to say, you know, God, what in the midst of this, whether you intentionally brought this into my life or not, or it's just simply part of the fact that we live in a fallen world, what kind of lessons can I learn from this? And in some respects, Psalm 77 is a good example of how we can turn what is a very negative experience for many of us right now into something that could be a deeply spiritual lesson that we could learn that would apply to the rest of our lives.
I think that's exactly right. And what happens, as you see it in the second half of the psalm, it's a focus on God's goodness in the past, and so the speaker is remembering all of that, and he's obviously anticipating that those wondrous rescues that he can remember from the past are also the order of the day now, and so he looks to God to rescue him from his trouble because he's become aware that he can't save himself. So it's a kind of a new kind of dawning on him about the proper focus of his faith and energy, I think.
Just before we let you go, let's, if we also can talk about chapters 6 and 7, because there you look at Isaiah 42, Isaiah 43, and in some respects talk about God's new thing and even what you call a matrix of groan. I thought that was pretty interesting. What are some lessons maybe we can learn from the book of Isaiah?
Well, in chapter 43, which is one of the most stunning and pivotal texts in the Bible, I think, God says, "Do not remember former things. I am doing a new thing. Can't you see it?" And that led me to think that we might now anticipate that we will see new things politically and economically and socially that might emerge out of this. And the danger to that community in Isaiah was that they would engage in nostalgia for the way it was, rather than to move on to new normals. And I think that we are seeing hints of some of those new normals that are marked by a great generosity. And the temptation will be to return to the tight-fisted parsimony of our economic system rather than seeing that the economic resources that are available to us are to be shared by everyone, and you can extrapolate them toward better housing, toward better health care, all kinds of things, but it requires us to see that we have to relinquish the old normals in order to get to a new place. And I think it's a marvelous text for meditating on that.
Well, again, we have a link to your website, and as people go there, they can get not only this book, but many of your other books, some of the audio, video, and speaking, and a variety of other resources. If people would like to contact you, they can do so as well. So, first of all, I want to thank you for writing this book and getting it out so quickly, because it has an August date on it, which is just amazing to me how fast sometimes they can produce these books. And so thank you for spending some time with us today, and thank you for writing a book to help us think about how to apply some of these Old Testament principles to our current pandemic and to begin to look ahead to what we're going to do in the future. So it's been a delight to have you on the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Kerby. I'm glad we could talk.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we will get into a different topic. It is the book called The Caleb Years, and we're going to hear from David and Kathleen Ingerson. And it's a really powerful book, but I think, again, we can learn some lessons about the loss of their son and their set of circumstances and what actually unfolded for them, and to maybe apply some of the lessons that sadly we are learning in the grief and pain and death that is taking place around us. So I wanted to give you a chance to hear from them. And as I mentioned just a few minutes ago, we have all sorts of articles that we've posted on the website. Earlier this hour, we talked with Representative Van Taylor. If you'd like to know more about this idea of a commission for the National Stockpile Oversight, we also have one called God, Caesar, and Lockdowns, which is one that we'll probably revisit again when we have Kelly Shackelford and Penna Dexter in the studio with us on Friday. Have one on a study of antibodies that maybe illustrate that we don't have as many people having had the disease and the antibodies for it as we thought. And so those are just a few of the articles we've posted on the website. So let me encourage you to go there. And my commentary today is available to you, as well as some of the action items. So take the time to visit the website, pointofview.net. Print out some of those articles, maybe take some action, and maybe even read my Viewpoints commentary for today. It's all available for you. We'll take a break and talk about the Caleb years right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you've been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Of course, it is also a very difficult one maybe to hear as well, as we talk about the Caleb years. It is about a 300-page book, and it's an incredible story, and there are all sorts of twists and turns, and it's a roller coaster and all of the rest, but we'll do our best to try to cover much of it in this hour. Of course, we have information about this on our website, pointofview.net. And it is written by David Ingerson, who is an Air Force officer. As a matter of fact, you'll pick up that very quickly as we talk about the fact that he has traveled, first in the Air Force and then as a pilot as well, and has also been a teacher and evangelist, an incredible storyteller and writer, as you'll pick up. And also we have his wife, Kathleen Ingerson, as well, joining with us. But first of all, David, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Kerby.
And then Kathleen, I think you're on the other line as well, aren't you?
Yes, I am, sir. Good to be with you.
Very good. This is a long story, but I just think maybe the best thing I can do, David, is kind of sit back and let you start telling the story. Maybe let Kathleen jump in a little bit as well, because it is the story, of course, of Caleb, as people might have gathered from the title of the book. And we're going to get into conversations about health and grief and struggles and all sorts of things, but it has certainly been a very important book. And the subtitle, I think, illustrates it as well. When God Doesn't Make Sense. I was struck by the fact that a number of individuals that we've interviewed over the years, people like Michael Johnson, Mark Batterson, Eugene Peterson, and many others have endorsed the book. And really, if you're looking for a book that ties it all up nicely in a bow, not necessarily the case, because if nothing else, that's life, isn't it? But David, can you kind of share the story, if you would?
Yes, sir. If I may first, very quickly, I just want to say God has increasingly been moving and showing us that our story is to be his story. And just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many, he draws us into his story, often through suffering. And we believe our proper view of Christ as the King will help us, in fact, will redeem our suffering to be used for his glory. So, the story. I moved to Okinawa, Japan as a young Air Force officer with two young children. Two more were born on the island. The second one was this son, Caleb, right before we left the island, actually, after 4 years. And he was born with a number of life-threatening congenital anomalies, not the least of which was a seriously malformed heart. Within just hours of birth, he had been diagnosed with these just a whole slew of problems. Esophagus didn't connect to his stomach, but rather his trachea did. That's very dangerous. He had functionally half a heart. He had no anal opening. He had a fistula connection between his urethra and his rectum or the large intestine. Bottom line is the numerous problems he had resulted in him being medevaced off the island, and I didn't understand at the time, but the medical experts at the neonatal intensive care unit understood he would not most likely survive the long flight from Okinawa to Travis Air Force Base, Sacramento, California, but he did. They sent a neonatologist, they sent a flight nurse, and they sent a medical technician, in addition to what we call a double augmented crew, meaning not 2 pilots but 3, and not 1 flight nurse but 2. They had double of everything. There were huge resources to try to save the child's life, and we did. And initially he lived. He ended up having surgery day of birth. He had open heart surgery at 6 days of birth in San Francisco. The child endured 10 major surgeries altogether, 5 of which were open heart surgery. Unfortunately, following his 3rd open heart surgery, he was infected with HIV. So
yes,
when we hear the word virus, when we hear and see all of the fervor over the pandemic of COVID-19, we have a identifying heart in mind, because for years the menacing virus was something that was so vivid and bold in our lives. I'll tell you one sort of humorous story, but also sobering. My wife was working as a home health care nurse, and here I was taking care of my other 4 children as an Air Force officer on a weekend. And my son was newly infected, that is, newly diagnosed. It was 9 months that he was infected before we knew to have him tested. So I was not wearing gloves when I tended to my son. He had a man-made anal opening, and he had a colostomy, and he had diarrhea, and he was bleeding from both ends, meaning his anus was bleeding, his colostomy was bleeding. And, of course, being an HIV-positive patient, a prudent father would wear gloves when tending to his son and taking care of him, but I refused. I was obstinate. I was stubborn. I thought it was disrespectful to my son to put on gloves. I had a friend who was aware of this, and he said to me, David, if you don't wear gloves, you may not be there for your other children someday. So I decided to wear gloves. Well, if I may, at that jumping off point, we should just jump back real quick and give a couple of words of things that I think are relevant and helpful to people today. This child was 26 days old when finally I was comfortable leaving him. He was at the University of California, San Francisco Medical Center. He had all of these life support, tubes and helps attached and doctors. I left my wife and he and flew back to Okinawa. And then a week later, believe it or not, my mother flew the child to Michigan, gave him into the care of her mother, and then came back to Okinawa for just 9 days to clean up, wrap up, and take our other 3 children, small children, ages 3 through 7, take them back to the States and rendezvous with our baby. Well, military housing, where we lived in Okinawa, has certain standards. You don't leave military base housing without cleaning your home. In fact, back in the day, they used to use a white glove to inspect the oven. So we knew we had a big task before us. And, of course, I had to go back to my job and work and help prepare for my replacement, as I was leaving an important key position in the organization as an officer and as a pilot. One day, the day before our movers were scheduled to arrive in our house in Okinawa and pack up our household for shipping, a woman from our church with 2 teenage boys showed up at our front door out of the blue. We didn't necessarily know them real well. I was a leader in the church. I was an ordained elder, and I led our mission trips to the Philippines as a young officer, and so I was very visible in the church. My wife was. This woman stood at my front door, and I saw them holding mops and brooms. I looked at her and said, hello, good morning, and she said, we're here to help.
To clean you up, yeah.
Kirby, it actually brings me to tears right now, just remembering the story, because we were so stressed at that time in our lives to the point of distress. We had one baby who was a heart failure baby, 1 month old, that was in the States, and here we were back in Okinawa to clean up the household, gather our other 3 young children, and move our household. And I, by the way, didn't go to the job I expected to go to.
Let's take a break and finish the story, but there are a lot of lessons to be learned from this book, The Caleb Years, and we'll talk about some of those right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a recent column, Dennis Prager argues that we're seeing a dress rehearsal for a police state. Although I think he makes a convincing case, I'm intrigued by people's response to it. Some people see it, while others do not. It's like watching people look at an optical illusion. Some people see it, others do not. Prager argues that our country is closer to a police state than ever before, and he hastens to add that the police state does not mean a totalitarian state. We still have freedoms, as evidenced by the fact that he could write his column, but he says there are 4 hallmarks of a police state. First are draconian laws depriving citizens of elementary civil rights. Over the last few weeks, I cannot even count the number of times I've talked about draconian policies or extreme policies issued by governors, mayors, and judges. Americans have been banned from going to work, meeting in groups, and going to beaches and parks. Second is a mass media supportive of the state's messaging and deprivation of rights. We see that in the harsh reaction to asking questions about the value of certain policies and the decision by big tech to remove posts considered misinformation. Third is the use of police. We've seen people being handcuffed for playing ball with their children in a park or beach. We've seen people being fined for sitting on a beach or listening to a sermon in their parked cars with the windows rolled up. And fourth is the presence of snitches. One governor even set up a snitch line so that you could turn in your fellow citizens. As I've said, many see these as police state tactics. Others, however, respond that these are merely temporary and pose no threat to our liberty. That may be true, but it is shocking how willing Americans have been to conform to what might not have even been allowed a few months ago. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Take Kerby and the Point of View team with you on the go with the Point of View app. Search for Point of View Radio at the Apple or Google Play stores.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue your conversation today with David Ingerson, as well as his wife, Kathleen. I might just mention under David's website is linked the davidingerson.com, and under Kathleen's, we also have the Christians in Action Mission International. And David, you were telling the story of some people showing up with mops in their hands, and as a result, there are some great lessons that you've learned, because oftentimes as people know your need, the body of Christ, the church, can really make a difference in some of these situations. And if you know individuals in your community right now that have children with disabilities or a variety of other things, that's an opportunity for us to be the hands and feet of Jesus, aren't we?
Yes, Kerby. You know, I would say that it is so common for us as people, when we encounter someone that may be close in our church or even closer, they're going through a time of stress that could take them to distress, meaning they may be grieving the loss of a family member or an ill, sick family member, and people don't know what to do, so they will say, "Oh, if you need anything, call me," and hand them their card. The person who is distressed is not going to call. That person doesn't know, can't even organize his thinking. My mind was mush. I couldn't remember. I couldn't think. I went to fly at the Presidential Airlift Wing some years later, and after my son died in my arms, I couldn't memorize anymore like I had for years. And as an Air Force pilot, you need to know how to memorize. So the point is, when someone is distressed, they need your physical presence. And I'd say to people, don't ask them to call you, because they won't. They can't. Just show up. And don't forget the mop and broom. So this young mother and her 2 teenagers, they showed up at my door with mop and broom, and they knew Military family housing had to be cleaned, spick and span, for the inspectors before we'd be authorized to leave the base. And so they showed up to help. And, you know, even to this day, that was 1997. Even to this day, it brings tears to my eyes to remember seeing them standing on our on our doorstep. And we tell people routinely, don't ask them to call you, just show up, and don't forget the mop and broom.
Mm-hmm. Kathleen, let me come to you for just a minute, because we've had a chance to hear some of David's side of the story, but I also know that the mom's side of the story is something I think a lot of us would like to hear as well.
Yes, sir. Well, listening to your conversation with Walter Brueggemann earlier in the show, Virus as a Summons to Faith, the book that he wrote, and I haven't read the book, obviously, but I tuned in to your words and his words, because he was speaking of the current virus, but we 20 years ago were dealing with a different virus. And God used the virus in my son Caleb's life as a summons to my faith. And it sounds like there are many verses from the book of Isaiah that he writes about in his verse, Isaiah 43, Isaiah 41. I'm not sure the verses that he is writing about, but I know the verses that God used in my heart to draw me unto him, to increase my faith, to point me to Jesus, to point me to his faithfulness, his love, his goodness during a very difficult, during grief, during loss, during death. In the New Testament, in the parable of the persistent widow, at the end of that parable it says, when Jesus returns, will he find faith on the earth? And that's the question God, the Holy Spirit asks of me. Will I find faith? Will I find my faith in you? It's not my faith, it's his faith that he puts in me. And that's a lesson that God used during those years, faith in his goodness. And he gave me a measure of grace to see above the circumstances, above my grief, above my loss. Yes, I suffered all these things, but giving me more of his perspective. And the Old Testament says, my thoughts are not your thoughts, my ways not your ways. God, I want to know your thoughts. God, I want to know your ways. And oftentimes, most often than not, you know, when things are just all peachy keen in our lives, we're not paying attention to God as diligently, as intimately as we need to in times of stress and distress. And just want to pause here for a moment and thank God for his perspective. And all through the book of Isaiah, I see that the scriptures point us to Jesus. And of course, the most famous, one of the most famous verses, Isaiah 53:5, where Isaiah, predicts the one, Jesus, the servant who comes, and I'm going to right here read it, Isaiah 53:5. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed. In Romans, it talks about Abraham, the man of faith. Against all hope, in hope he believed, and righteousness was credited to him. And he is the father of our faith. And against all hope, I believe what God has said, the promises he has made, not only for my salvation, my justification, but my walk, my sanctification, is some would say, my walk that just doesn't end. It begins with justification, but it doesn't stop there. We walk a walk of faith as Abraham walked a walk of faith, and it took the promise of Isaac was promised, but it took years of walking in faith before the promise was given. And Abraham walked that walk of faith. And then when Isaac was given, what did God do? He rejoiced in the birth of his son, and they rejoiced. And Isaac means he laughs. God brought laughter to their home. God brought peace. But years later, God once again called him, take your son, your only son, and take him to the mount and sacrifice him. Mm-hmm. And I'm amazed because if you look at Scripture, Abraham immediately obeyed. The next morning, he got up and he went. He took his son, and he's willing to make that sacrifice. The very promise that was given to him. See, God wants us to surrender all, every part of our life, so that he can come in and reign. And when he comes in and reigns, then his glory will shine through us. And that really is what I want my life to be about. It's about his glory, not my glory, and his glory. When his glory shines through me, in the midst of trials, in the midst of suffering, in the midst of loss of life, in the midst of death, in the midst of all these things that we're so afraid of, God uses them to draw us into himself and reveal his glory so that others may see that glory, others may see that peace, others may see that goodness, the goodness of God. I mean, that's the number one question people ask during suffering and trials, and that is, how can this be the hand of God? God is good. How can God allow this? Why does the good man have to suffer? Well, we suffer because Christ suffered, and he's our example, and we see that in the New Testament as well. And he suffers for us, and we want to suffer. What's the scripture, David? From
Romans 5.
Philippians 3, 10 through 12.
Philippians 3, 10 through 12. We want to know Christ, the power of the resurrection, fellowship, participate in Christ's suffering.
And we can't know the power of the resurrection until we experience the suffering.
Very good.
And the power of the resurrection, in our life will be seen in the life of the others. And God will bring the nations unto himself, which is really what I want to see, and that's the promise that God has made. When Caleb died, like the life of Jehoshaphat, when he went out to battle, God fought the battle for him, but then he had 3 days of plunder. And I keyed in on those verses, 3 days of plunder. God, I want plunder. If I can't have my son on this, I want plunder. And of course, the plunder today is souls, the souls of the nations. And 3 days of plunder. And so, God, I'm asking for 1 million souls. If I can have my son, I want 1 million souls.
Okay, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll come back and maybe get into this a little bit more detail. We're talking today with David and Kathleen, and the book is entitled The Caleb Years. And if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know more about the book, or I'd like to go to the website, we have those links on our website, pointofview.net. We'll come back and talk a little bit more about also the impact that this had on the children, and what we can do maybe to reach out to anyone going through some kind of grief right now. So we'll take a break and continue the conversation as we focus on the Caleb years when God doesn't make sense. We'll take a break and have more right after this.
When you give to Point of View, does it make a difference? Jeremy Dies would tell you that it does. He grew up listening to Point of View in the back seat of his mom's car, and it helped to shape his thinking.
I had parents that were able to sit across from me at the dinner table after we listened to Marlon Maddox and Kerby Anderson years ago and think through what the scriptures say about these issues of current significance in our lives. That's only possible because Point of View has come along and ministered into my life and made me who I am today. And here I am today defending religious liberty, partly because Marlon Maddox and Penn Dexter and Kerby Anderson were the ones that were pushing me towards all that. They taught me how to think through these issues. They didn't tell me what to think. They taught me how to think.
Each gift you give will change lives. Not every Point of View listener will become a Jeremy, but if they listen for very long, they will be changed. And that will change how they impact and affect the lives of the people around them. So make that decision to change a life today. Join the Truth Team and boldly stand for truth in a world of lies, distortion, and information manipulation. Go to pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's 1-800-347-5151.
Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again talking about the book, The Caleb Years. David Ingerson with us. And David, let me come to you for just a minute, because one of the questions I think a lot of people have is, you know, you have gone through this. You've dealt with all of these issues, and maybe we can give some principles that we can give to our listeners who, even though they have not lost a loved one, they've lost a friend, neighbor, coworker, family member, and you had to address not only the grief in your family's life, but your children's grief. And maybe we can use that to help people understand how to really help those individuals around them right now, even during this pandemic, that are struggling with grief. What would you say?
You know, Kerby, I would say, as I said previously, you just want to be a physical presence for people. So often when someone is grieving, a person might come to them and be embarrassed, afraid of what to say. Just say you're sorry and let them hug you. Oh, and by the way, we have learned when a grieving person hugs you, you better be prepared for them to grab you and hold you and hold you. And after about 1 potato, 2 potato, about 2.2 potato, I frankly am finished with the hug, but the grieving person quite likely will not be. Let them hold you. Don't pat their back. That's condescending. Just let them hug you. You don't have to say anything very grand and very insightful. In fact, it's probably better that you don't. Just tell them, I'm here for you. I'm sorry. Hold them. Let them hug you. Show you care in that way, because it's that simplicity. You know that my son died after I had been 3 months at the Presidential Airlift Wing at Andrews Air Force Base, Washington, D.C. 3 months. And that was a 4-year, we called it a tour of duty, a special tour of duty. For 3 years and 9 months, my son's name was mentioned 0 times in my squadron, where we flyers, and I was one of the senior leaders, the director of training for almost 3 years, and not one time was his name mentioned by a fellow flyer who they all basically knew of my son's death soon after I arrived at the base. And if his name had been said in my presence, I would have heard my fellows singing, and I would have been encouraged. Now, would I have possibly had a tear in public? Possibly. But we need to let people who are grieving grieve. We need to let them weep. In fact, I was in Tel Aviv. I had taken some congressmen as part of my job in the Air Force, and this is in a story we discuss in the book. And a woman at my hotel, an Israeli, we were restricted to our hotel, so she was kind of a lounge curator, and I walked up to her to ask her to help me with one of the letters in the Hebrew alphabet from my master's degree I'd forgotten, and she was helping me, and somehow the fact that my son had died in my arms 3 months prior came up, and she looked at me and asked me this question. She said, "Have you wailed?" I said, "No, tell me more." And I had read here and there in commentaries, ancient Israel would hire professional wailers to circle them, surround them. You can see Jesus talking to wailers in some of the stories in the New Testament. And she said to me, "Today, here in Tel Aviv in Israel, we still hire professional wailers to form a circle around you for a week or 2 weeks after the family member has died, so you can wail publicly and no one will hear you." I came home from that trip. I said to my wife, I wish we had that. And, you know, I think we as a culture and a community, we're not comfortable with grief. We're nervous about it. Don't be nervous because your time is coming. Don't be afraid to just be there for the person who's grieving. We believe that during that period of shock that most of those who write about grieving talk about, a person just needs your physical presence. Go over and clean their house. Show up with a mop and broom and be that presence for them. Now, what about the grieving person? You have to give a little bit of grace to people around you because they don't know what to do. Don't share your story with someone who's grieving. And if you're grieving and someone shares their story with you, just sort of excuse yourself from it. And we think that if we can do these things, we will be more healthy at grieving. We believe you have to embrace, that is, you have to express, you have to be honest about the emotions, let them come out. My mother has been widowed twice, and her grandson, my son, died, and this woman now has become a grief recovery specialist, and she will say, I don't let my students in my grief recovery class weep, cry. I help them cry. Because you need to cry. We need to cry in order to be healthy. Now, we don't have to stay there. You know, Kerby, 3 months after my son died in my arms, a fellow pilot at the Presidential Airlift Wing and I were driving from Andrews Air Force Base up to Baltimore, Maryland to go to a FAA office for some business. 3 months after my son's death, this was one of the few Christians in the organization who was involved in some Bible studies ministries with me, and he looked at me and he said, when are you going to be finished grieving for your son? Kerby, I heard myself answer, and the answer surprised me. And I said, I'm sorry, the question was, how long are you going to keep grieving for your son? Sorry, I answered the question by saying, as long as he's still dead. Now, I'm not telling someone that you have to be a victim to suffering, grief, difficult emotion your entire life. No. But if you will truly not try to bottle up those emotions but let them out, kind of like whaling inside the circle of professional whalers, you will be more healthy sooner, because that person who's dead is not going to come back. That person who has died isn't going to come back. If you believe and embrace Christ and believe that he died to pay the penalty for your sin, to purchase for you a place in heaven, which he offers as a free gift, if you receive the gift, you will see that person. As long as they have put their faith and trust in Christ, you will see them again. We don't even tell people to encourage freshly grieving people with those words necessarily. Sometimes it's appropriate, sometimes it's not. You have to ask God to give you wisdom. Just be a presence for them.
You know, one of the things that people have sometimes taken out of Scripture is it says we are not to grieve, but they leave out the last part, as those who have no hope. And sometimes people have taken that verse out of context and say, well, we're not supposed to grieve. And, of course, in this sort of death-denying culture that America is, we are expected to bury people on Friday and be back to work on Monday. And this idea of mourning and grief is something that you certainly have addressed. But just before we take a break, let me talk about something else, because throughout your book, you talk about some of these ministry opportunities that have developed, and I think people can see that, but share some of those, if you might, with us.
Yes. Here's a powerful story. My wife was in a phone booth, and I know today some of you, the younger listeners, may not be familiar with a phone booth, but my wife was in a phone booth in a hospital in San Francisco. Our son was barely a month old, and our people from Okinawa were calling us every day, or we would call them. And one day they asked me for my checking account, and the next day they told me they'd deposit $2,000. Well, that's not ministering to others, but it is. The church ministered to us. $2,000 in 1997, that was something. Well, my wife was about to step out of the phone booth, and a woman heard her praying with our people in Okinawa in our church, and she stopped, and as my wife emerged from the phone booth, she was asked, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you a Christian?" So my wife said, "Well, yes." She said, "Please come with me. My brother is so distraught. His 10-year-old daughter, my niece, is about to go back into open heart surgery again for the second time today because the bleeding won't stop. And he is too nervous and afraid to go into the room where she is. He won't go in and see her." So my wife came and found me and said, "Come with me. Let's go pray." She told me quickly what was happening. We gathered together suddenly in the hallway. There must have been a circle of about 8 people suddenly. And we prayed for this gentleman wearing his blue jeans and his black Harley-Davidson T-shirt. And I put my hand on his back as I began to just pray a brief prayer. I felt him shuddering and shaking. And it wasn't a profound prayer. We didn't get into some big theological concept. We just prayed for him and said amen. And as soon as I said amen, he wiped his sweaty palms on his jeans. He picked his head up and he marched straight into the pediatric intensive care unit for cardiothoracic surgery patients there in the hospital to see his 10-year-old daughter just in time to see them wheel her bed out of that room, cross the hallway into the elevator, and back down to the operating room for the second open heart surgery in one day. 2 days later, this sister of the father of the patient found my wife again and came running up to her very excited and said, "Oh, ma'am," she didn't even know our names. She said, "Ever since the day when you prayed, my brother, who was previously so fearful and he would not go in and see his daughter when she had surgery, he has been by her side at her beck and call, right there with her with no fear. And we reflected. We said, oh, God, there are opportunities like this all around us. And Kerby, I could tell you story after story after story.
Yes.
I hope we can get to one more that happened with the Josh McDowell book in San Francisco, but maybe after the break. I'm not sure.
Let's do that. And we'll leave that as a cliffhanger, and we'll come back again. If you just joined us talking about the book, The Caleb Years, David Ingerson with us, and also we had a chance to hear with Kathleen. We have information about them and the book on the website. You may be able to find it in your local bookstore, but most likely we would encourage you to get it either in hardback or in Kindle. And we'll take a break. And if nothing else, it is a book that has been endorsed by a number of people that we've had on the program in the past. Thought you'd like to hear that story because you might be trying to minister to somebody right now that's dealing with some of these same issues. We'll take a break. Be back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. It was a warm spring Thursday evening in Greenville, Mississippi. One would have said it was a perfectly normal evening for King James Bible Baptist Church to host a Bible study, but things were hardly normal. A highly communicable virus had infected the world. Everyone was shut down, or so it seemed. The town's mayor had even canceled all gatherings in the town, including religious gatherings. Still, Pastor Charles Hamilton made adjustments and readied himself to preach to a bunch of cars. Well, he meant to preach to people, but they were confined to their cars. That week, the mayor of Greenville had even prohibited so-called drive-in church services where parishioners drove to the church, parked in the lot, and stayed in their cars, listening through the closed doors and windows to hear Pastor Hamilton preach. It was a strange time. Nonetheless, Pastor Hamilton was shocked when he walked outside. The entire police force was there, piling out of their cruisers. One officer rushed to inform Pastor Hamilton that his rights had been suspended. Pastor Hamilton thanked the officer, picked up his Bible, and continued to preach anyway. Now, we don't know what the officers thought about the sermon that evening, but we do know this. It took 2 lawsuits and the intervention of the Attorney General of the United States to get to Greenville's mayor to stop discriminating against Pastor Hamilton. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
Hi, I'm Kelly Shackelford, President and Chief Counsel of First Liberty Institute. You can protect your religious freedom by going to firstliberty.org to download your free Religious Liberty Protection Kit. Our attorneys created kits for churches, ministries, Christian schools, military members, students, and teachers, and the workplace. Get your Religious Liberty Protection Kit at firstliberty.org. That's firstliberty.org.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Take a few more minutes as we talk about the Caleb years. And again, David Ingerson with us. And David, we only have a few minutes left, and you wanted to tell the story about Josh McDowell, so you have the floor. What would you like to share with us?
It'll be real quick. We were in the Ronald McDonald House in San Francisco. There was a family with a 14-year-old son who had very serious burns from a camping accident. After months in the hospital, they were leaving the next day. Well, that morning, before my wife and I went to the hospital from the Ronald McDonald House, we knew their room. We had spoken together about the things of faith. We're not so sure he was yet a man of faith, actually. And we shared these things night after night. So we took a tithe from the $2,000 I mentioned previously our church gave us. We took $200 and we inserted it in the front cover of the paperback More Than a Carpenter by Josh McDowell. We slid it under their door and went off to the hospital. When we got back that night, another family that knew us, that we had evening conversation with, said, "You should have been here when that couple emerged from their room to get their son and to go back." They live in Northern California. She said, he's a tattoo artist up there. She said when he saw the book and then he saw the $10, $20 bills, he jumped and leaped up and down, and he said, "This is the greatest day of my life. Nothing like this has ever happened to me before. Here." And he thrust one of the $20 bills from the cover of the book to this bystander who observed it. And in his hilarious joy, he tithed, in a sense, off what we gave to him out of his hilarious joy. Let me jump, if I may, to a very important story, because, like you say, little time left. There's a story where my wife actually slapped me because we were fighting over our child, who was 3.5 years old.
I did read that in the book, and it's a funny story, but at the time probably wasn't very funny. Yeah, go ahead.
That's true. And I know we don't have much time to tell all the details. I'll just say that it's a favorite story of many people that read the book. And the bottom line is that I got it right up in my wife's face, and as the secretary of the National Association of Victims of Transfusion-Acquired AIDS, NAVTA, I wanted to lobby Congress. In fact, we did meet with Senator Carl Levin at that time. I wanted to make things better. I wanted to increase the sum of the guidelines about how the blood industry can collect blood. Bottom line is I wanted to use our son in a media event. My wife did not. I got up in her face and said, "I'm the man of this house. I've decided this is what we're going to do." She hauled up and slapped me, and the whole rest of the night is a comedy of errors that resulted finally in a beautiful time of reconciliation and recommitting ourselves to each other. We said, Kerby, when we wed, now 34 years ago at that time, I guess 15 years or so, we said the D word, divorce, is not authorized. We are going to work through every trial and trouble we have. The last story I really need to tell, I don't know if you have time for it, I hope, is at my son's funeral. I had said to my wife, I will bring the keynote address at my son's funeral. She challenged that. She thought I was a bit unstable for having said that. I said, no, my son died in my arms. I'll bring a message of hope to those that come to celebrate his homegoing. My mother, we'd prayed for at that time for 14 years, since I had put my faith and trust in Christ as a young freshman at the U.S. Air Force Academy after Jim Irwin, the Apollo astronaut, spoke. And I shared the gospel, very simple, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, and I gave an eyes-wide-open altar call at this little country church in Michigan that was packed out. My mother was the first of 8 to stand and say, yes, I want to put my faith in Christ. And I'm telling you, Kerby, at that time I wasn't so much ready to actually embrace that. In other words, she stood and I thought, oh, she's just standing to support her grieving son. But I'm telling you, these years later, the proof has been in the pudding. This woman is walking with Christ. I already told you she's a grief recovery specialist, which is real ministry for her, and she challenges, encourages people to live out their grief so that it won't overlive them. And the last piece I'll say about that is that after a worship service, the day after our son's burial, we drove to the cemetery. My mother was driving in front. It had just been the next day since she stood at the funeral, made a profession of faith. And I asked my mother after the worship service the next day, Mother, when you stood yesterday, what did that mean? And she looked me in the eye, having been widowed twice. Mm-hmm. She looked me in the eye and said it was time. And Kerby, something about the way she said it was time gripped me to the point where I knew it was real. So I relayed that story to my wife as we drove the short 2 miles from the church to the burial site. And as tears streamed down my wife's cheeks, I said, what are your tears saying? It's kind of a silly question for a husband to ask his wife the day after they buried their son. And I just told her this very powerful story. And she said the following, with her face cringing and the tears streaming down her cheeks. She said, your mother, if it took the death of our son to bring her to faith, then so be it.
Powerful.
And I said, I don't know about that, girlfriend. I'm not quite ready. I need more time. Mm-hmm. God is good, and if we will allow him to use our grief for good, he will use it, suffering, to grow perseverance, to grow character, to grow hope, that does not disappoint, because his love is then poured out into our hearts by his Holy Spirit, that we would then share that love with others, not just around us, but around the world. And we believe that's why God brought us to Christians in Action, to serve this mission, who has missionaries in 21 countries. And our vision is to see 15,000 people daily praying, along with Matthew 9:37 and 38. Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but laborers few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send forth laborers into his harvest. And we're praying that, and we're trying to raise up 15,000 to daily pray with us. If any of your listeners want to join us, all they need to do is type 937-prayer into their computer phone or their internet, and I'm sure they'll get to our website. They can sign up, first name, last name, email address. We'll send them a weekly email to pray. And we just believe that God uses these difficult times in our lives for his purpose and his glory. And I have no idea if you have time for one year story after my son died. Do we have time?
Well, we're pretty close. I think I better just end with that one and just simply say that if people want to hear the rest of the stories, that's why they need to get a copy of the book. And we have a link to the website. And it is just really a powerful story that you have. And thank you for sharing it today. And thank you for writing the book.
Yes, sir. It's been such a pleasure to be with you today, Kerby. We appreciate the opportunity to be with you. Hope to be with you again sometime.
Let's, if we can, recognize that we're coming to the end of our program today. And if you find yourself saying, okay, there has been a lot that's come through the broadcast over the last 2 hours, I might need to listen to some of that again. We, in the first half hour, spent some time talking with Representative Van Taylor about some of the issues of the pandemic. And then we talked with Dr. Walter Brueggemann about how we can maybe take some of these principles in the Old Testament and apply those to our lives. Then, of course, we've had a chance to talk with David and Kathleen Ingerson, and that book is entitled The Caleb Years. And if that's not enough, I might just mention my Viewpoints commentary today is one that you might want to read. We have some take action items. And while we're talking about prayer, one of the things we encourage you to do is to also consider signing up for our Pray for America announcements that we send out from time to time. Last week, of course, we focused a lot of time and attention on the whole issue of the National Day of Prayer, but we will bring you some other prayer targets. And, of course, we'll also later this week or next week also be bringing you some other action items. So that's one of the reasons to make sure that you visit the website, pointofview.net. And if you haven't given us your email, we would encourage you to do so. That way we can, of course, if you would like to do so, send you my Viewpoints commentary, which shows up in your inbox every single day. Also to give you an update on some of the interviews we're doing, and as well as all sorts of other great resources. So all of it is available at the website, pointofview.net. And tomorrow we'll get into some more news and information about this virus pandemic, how we can respond to it, some things we've learned even from the testimony today by Dr. Anthony Fauci in front of the Senate, and, of course, a vote coming up in this Friday on another piece of legislation we talked about with Van Taylor. So we've just got a lot to cover by Friday in our weekend edition. Penna Dexter, Kelly Shackelford, we'll do our best to cover all of it, but it's going to be a busy week and lots of activity and lots of information that we want to pass on to you. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Have a great day. We'll see you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View radio talk show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @Point of View RTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @Point of View RTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.